Nurse Chen, perhaps you should stick to taking vitals and leave the medical decisions to actual physicians. That was what Dr. Richard Hargrove said to Sarah Chen at 2:47 in the morning, his voice dripping with condescension in front of a Navy SEAL's terrified family. He didn't know that 3 hours later, that same SEAL would still be alive because of the treatment she'd suggested. He had no idea that Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had spent 12 years training combat medics in Baghdad, that her hands had held together things most people would call impossible to save. They didn't know. None of them did. And that was exactly how Sarah had planned it. Oak Creek Memorial's night shift smells like bleach mixed with burnt coffee, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing their relentless 250 Hz hum. Sarah Chen moves through the emergency department at 2 in the morning with the kind of economical grace that comes from practice, from repetition, from knowing exactly where to step so the squeaking tile doesn't disturb anyone. Her scrubs are 2 sizes too large, deliberately chosen that way. Her dark hair is pulled back so tightly it could have been painted on. She keeps her eyes down. Most of the staff at Oak Creek Memorial have stopped noticing her entirely, which is precisely the point. She's in the equipment room restocking the crash cart when the first sound comes, the specific metallic clang of the ambulance bay doors hitting their stops, the one that means someone critical is coming. Not just coming. Running. Sarah's hands don't pause in their work. The large bore for trays slot into their designated compartments, 16 gauge, 18 gauge, 20 gauge. For seconds per tray. Muscle memory. The kind that comes from muscle memory. The paramedic radio crackles static, then a voice cuts through, Oak Creek, inbound code yellow, male, 34, mechanism blunt force trauma to anterior chest during tactical training evolution, respiratory distress developing, O2 sat 86 and falling, ETA 3 minutes. Sarah's chest goes absolutely still. Code yellow. Training evolution. Anterior chest trauma. That's SEAL language. That's her son David's command structure. She finishes loading the crash cart in silence, moves to secure it, and then, only then, allows herself to walk toward the ER bay where the controlled chaos is already beginning. Residents are calling orders. Nurses are pulling equipment. Dr. Richard Hargrove, Chief of Emergency Medicine, hasn't arrived yet, and everyone knows it because everything moves just slightly slower without him, like an engine running on 5 cylinders. The ambulance bay doors burst open at 2:51. The stretcher comes through like a shot, paramedics calling their report in the clipped rhythm of professionals who've done this 1,000 times. Male. Mid-30s. Muscular build that speaks to a specific kind of training. Navy blue flight suit. The face is young, composed despite the pain behind his eyes, which tells Sarah everything. He's trained for this. He's been hit before. He knows how to compartmentalize. And then her brain registers him completely. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb. Her son David's commanding officer. The man whose voice comes through on David's encrypted phone calls, whose name appears in David's deployment schedule, whose leadership David speaks about with the kind of respect reserved for people who know how to keep you alive. Sarah feels her jaw tighten for exactly one breath. Then she locks it down. Her face becomes a smooth, neutral surface, the face of a night shift nurse who doesn't know anyone, who's just another set of hands in the machinery. She moves into position alongside the gurney, opposite the paramedic, ready to assist with transfer to the trauma bay. Webb's eyes track across the staff. When they pass Sarah, there's no flicker of recognition. Which is correct. She works at the hospital where his commanding officer's son deploys from. She has never met him. She has no connection to him. She exists in the background. The transfer happens with textbook precision. Webb moves from ambulance stretcher to hospital stretcher in one smooth motion. He's practiced this too. Tactical training scenario, knows how to keep his chest stable. His wife and teenage daughter are already inside the hospital, directed by someone to the waiting area, their faces holding that specific mix of terror and forced calm that families wear when someone in uniform gets hurt. Hargrove arrives 9 seconds later, his silver hair perfect despite the 2:58 a.m. timestamp, Italian shoes clicking against tile like a clock measuring out territory. He's still buttoning his white coat as he approaches the trauma bay, and everyone moves slightly closer to the walls because Hargrove's entrance always changes the air pressure in a room. It's not that he's not exactly 5'10" with the soft body of someone who exercises on a schedule rather than necessity, but he carries himself like a man who has never once questioned his right to be in charge. Tension pneumothorax development, Hargrove announces, and his voice fills the bay with the kind of certainty that doesn't invite questions. Chest tube insertion, left lateral approach, fourth intercostal space. Someone page anesthesia for conscious sedation. Now. Sarah is setting up the insertion tray when she notices Webb's breathing pattern, shallow, rapid, compensatory, the breathing of a man whose left lung is collapsing because pressure is building in his pleural space. His neck veins are starting to distend. The mechanism of injury was blunt force to the anterior chest, which means the impact could have torn the pulmonary tissue, could have caused the kind of small pneumothorax that's stable for hours and then suddenly isn't. She's seen this progression exactly 17 times. She knows how it ends if the pressure keeps building unchecked. She moves to Hargrove's side, keeping her voice at the level of a respectful question, not a suggestion. Doctor, his mechanism of injury to the anterior chest combined with that respiratory pattern, have you considered needle decompression before chest tube insertion? If pressure's still building, even a conscious sedation delay could. Hargrove cuts her off mid-breath. Nurse Chen. The way he says her name, stretched out, emphasized, is like a teacher addressing a child who's spoken out of turn. He doesn't look at her directly, but at her chest, her uniform, somewhere in the general vicinity of her existence without actually seeing her. Webb's wife and daughter have come to the bay entrance, holding each other, watching their husband and father work through the edges of panic. Perhaps you should stick to taking vitals and leave the medical decisions to actual physicians. The words arrive in the room like a cold front, and Sarah feels the temperature drop, feels the gathered residents glance sideways at her the way people do when someone has been publicly diminished. One of them, a young resident named Chen, no relation, which always creates a specific awkwardness, actually steps backward, creating distance between himself and Sarah as if humiliation might be contagious. Sarah's hands finish arranging the chest tube insertion kit. Her jaw clenches for one beat. Just one. Then she straightens her spine, meets Hargrove's gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to show she's heard him, not long enough to seem defiant, and steps back from the trauma bay with her expression perfectly, utterly neutral. The work continues around her. Anesthesia arrives. Webb gets his consciousness-altering medications. Hargrove performs the chest tube insertion with technically perfect precision, sliding the tube between the ribs with the smooth confidence of someone who's done this procedure 400 times. The monitor shows the immediate response, oxygen saturation rising, breathing pattern normalizing, the visible relief on Webb's face as the pressure releases and his lungs can expand again. Sarah finishes her shift at 7 in the morning. She documents everything she's observed in Webb's chart, the respiratory pattern, the mechanism, the timing of symptom development, in clinical language that carries no editorializing, no suggestion, no trace of anything beyond pure data. Then she signs out to the day shift nurse, whose name is Patricia and who doesn't look at Sarah while receiving report, and Sarah walks out through the employee entrance into the Savannah morning where heat is already building like a pressure system. She sits in her car for exactly 4 minutes without turning on the engine. Her hands are steady on the steering wheel. Her breathing is even. The frustration she feels exists somewhere deep, in a place where she's learned to store things that can't be said, can't be acted on, can only be endured. She's had practice with this kind of silence. 12 years of practice. 3 complete tours in Baghdad. 2 Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medals for the work she did in trauma settings that made Oak Creek Memorial's emergency department look like a pediatric playroom. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when she turned on her phone and saw the message from David, sent at 3 in the morning, his time zone, *, heard Webb got brought into your hospital. Watch his 6. Hargrove's got a reputation for cutting corners with military patients. *. Sarah read that message 4 times. Then she put the phone down and drove home through Savannah traffic, her left leg aching where the shrapnel sits, her mind already calculating the way she might position herself to prevent a doctor's arrogance from becoming a Navy SEAL's coffin. She had no idea what was about to walk through those emergency department doors. She had no idea that by the end of her shift in 36 hours, everything she'd built in the shadows would come out into the light, and that the careful anonymity she'd constructed piece by piece over 18 years would shatter completely. All she knew was what she'd always known: when you see someone about to die, you don't ask permission. You move. You act. You save them. Even if saving them costs you everything. That was the code. That had always been the code. The 72 hours that followed were a masterclass in watching someone die slowly while the system protected the man killing him. Marcus Webb's condition didn't improve. It plateaued at a dangerous middle ground, not quite crashing, not recovering, suspended in a state of managed decline that felt like being slowly strangled by protocol. Sarah watched the numbers drift each shift she worked, oxygen saturation holding at 92% instead of climbing back to 98, respiratory rate climbing from 16 breaths a minute to 20, blood pressure requiring more frequent monitoring, the subtle signs that something wasn't resolving the way Hargrove kept insisting it would. The attending rounds became theatre, polished performance with predetermined conclusions. Hargrove would sweep in, scan the chart with the casual authority of someone who'd never been questioned, and announce progression that the monitors contradicted. Stabilizing nicely, he'd say on day 2, while Webb's oxygen sat at 91% and his wife gripped the bedrail with whitened knuckles in the observation room. During morning rounds on the second shift, Sarah presented the overnight vitals in her usual measured tone. Respiratory rate elevated from baseline, 19 breaths per minute, previous was 14. Oxygen saturation running 89 to 92 despite 4 liters nasal cannula. Patients more restless despite the sedation protocol. Pain scores up since yesterday. She delivered the information like data, which is what it was, and Hargrove's head snapped up with the expression of a man whose authority had been questioned in front of his residents. The silence that followed tasted like copper. "Thank you, Nurse Chen, but I can read numbers," he said, his voice carrying that particular edge that made every resident in the room find sudden interest in their shoes. "What I need is someone who understands clinical context, not just button pushing." The residents shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes, their discomfort palpable as a pressure change in the room. She had made them all uncomfortable by speaking. That was the real transgression. Over the next hours, she caught the nickname spreading through the unit like an infection. "Our little worrier," Hargrove called her when she flagged another concern about the patient's trending vitals. The resident physicians shifted in place, some of them glancing at her with something between pity and relief that they weren't the target. "Always so concerned," he said to a family member, his voice dripping with paternal condescension, the kind of tone you'd use with an anxious child who doesn't understand how the world works. Each instance was small enough to ignore, deniable, designed to seem like affection when it was surgical in its precision. She understood what he was doing, establishing dominance through humiliation, creating a baseline where everyone accepted his framing of her as an alarmist, as someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted. The break room at 3 in the morning on the second shift became a monument to isolation. Sarah had carried her Tupperware, rice and vegetables prepared the night before, a meal for the long hours ahead, and sat at the small table where nurses on night shift tried to steal minutes of peace. The room had 4 other people in it when she entered, 2 nurses writing notes, a tech reviewing a chart, another nurse sipping coffee with the glassy-eyed expression of someone 3 hours from the end of a 12-hour shift. She opened her container and the smell of cold rice filled the small space. Then she watched it happen with the clarity of someone trained to observe. A text message. A suddenly remembered task. "I need to check on something upstairs," the first nurse said, standing so quickly her chair scraped against linoleum like an animal's warning cry. "Lab's probably still holding those samples," the tech offered, moving toward the door. The second nurse drained her coffee in one swallow and announced she had charting. Within 45 seconds, the break room went quiet except for the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, that particular electric hum that sounded like 1,000 wasps trapped in thin glass. Sarah sat alone with her Tupperware and the bitter realization that they had practiced this, coordinated this, understood without speaking that proximity to her now carried a cost. The write-up appeared on the unit communication board on the morning of day 3, posted where everyone could see it without trying. Performance Improvement Plan, Chen. Overstepping scope of practice. Questioning physician orders. Creating tension with medical staff. Immediate correction required. Her signature was required on the acknowledgement line, an act of forced consent to her own condemnation. She stood in front of the board with a pen in her hand, aware that other staff members were watching from peripheral vision, pretending they weren't. Her hand moved to sign the document and she felt a tremor run through her fingers, not fear, not weakness, but the kind of physical rage that had to go somewhere since it couldn't go into her voice or her face. She had lived through worse. She knew this with absolute certainty. She had held a bleeding corpsman's intestines in place while artillery churned the desert around them and the sky turned red with smoke. She had performed emergency surgical airways with rounds passing overhead close enough that the wind of them made her ears pop. A piece of paper. A director's condescension. A system designed to protect itself instead of patients. She signed the document, her handwriting steady despite the trembling in her hands that no one could see, and walked away. But that wasn't the worst part. On day 3, during morning rounds with 12 people present, residents, attending, nursing staff, respiratory therapy, and Marcus Webb's wife and adult daughter standing in the observation room with their hands pressed against the glass, Hargrove stopped mid-presentation. His eyes found Sarah with the precision of a trained predator. "Nurse Chen," he said, his voice perfectly modulated, perfectly calm, the voice of a man about to perform surgery in front of an audience. "You seem particularly invested in this case. Are you emotionally compromised? Should we be concerned about your mental stability?" The question hung in the air like poison gas, invisible and lethal. The room went still. Someone's pen stopped moving. A resident's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Marcus Webb's wife gripped the glass with both hands, her daughter turning to look at her with confusion. Sarah took one measured breath. She felt a single tear escape her left eye, not from emotion but from the sheer pressure of restraint, the effort of holding an entire lifetime of combat experience behind a civilian nurse's uniform. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. Her voice, when she spoke, was like still water, calm, clear, with depths that had nothing to do with tears. "I've seen men die from pride, doctor," she said, each word separated by the weight of thousands of hours in places where mistakes meant body bags. "And it never gets easier to watch." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the monitors seemed to pause between beats. Hargrove's jaw tightened visibly, a small muscle spasming beneath his skin like something trying to escape. His hands clenched on the patient's chart hard enough that his knuckles went white. In that moment, Sarah understood that she had made an enemy who would not stop, who could not stop now because backing down would be an admission of weakness that his entire identity depended on denying. He was a man whose power came from the ability to diminish others, and she had just stood in front of an audience and refused to be diminished. His smile, when it finally came, had no warmth in it. The room dispersed slowly, staff members finding excuses to be elsewhere, the rounds concluding with an extra layer of tension that Sarah had introduced. Webb's wife mouthed something through the glass, words Sarah couldn't read but could interpret from the shape of them. "Thank you." The daughter squeezed her mother's hand. In the hallway afterward, one of the residents, a woman named Dr. Patel who had been quiet throughout, passed Sarah by the supply room and said in a voice barely audible, "That was incredible," before moving on before anyone could connect them. These small acknowledgements were dangerous for everyone. They could mark another person as compromised by association. The next 60 hours blurred into the standard rhythm of night shift work, but something had fundamentally shifted. The nursing staff's avoidance had become almost ceremonial now, less the awkward scrambling of day 2 and more a coordinated performance of her non-existence. She would walk into a room and conversations would stop mid-word. She would document vitals and staff members would avoid standing near her, as if proximity might transfer some kind of contamination. The write-up remained visible on the board, refreshed each shift, a constant reminder. Hargrove's rounds became even more theatrical, his confidence growing as he watched the staff's reaction to Sarah's isolation, understanding that his version of events was becoming the accepted narrative. She was the problem. The patient's lack of improvement wasn't the problem. The protocol that wasn't working wasn't the problem. Nurse Chen, with her inappropriate concerns and her emotional compromise, was the problem. And then, at 1:47 in the morning on the fourth shift, everything changed. At 2:47 in the morning, Sarah noticed what no one else had seen. The subtle shift in Marcus Webb's chest wall, the rise and fall no longer symmetrical. Distended neck veins like dark cords pulling taut beneath his skin. His left lung silent. Completely absent breath sounds on the left side, as if that entire cavity of his chest had simply ceased to exist. The pulse oximeter had been drifting for the last 6 minutes. 92. 90. 88. 84. The downward creep that meant something had fundamentally broken inside his thorax. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis formed in her mind with the clarity of Baghdad muscle memory, field hospitals where the pressure inside a collapsed lung could squeeze the heart itself, could stop a man's entire circulatory system in under 10 minutes. She'd seen it happen exactly 3 times before. Twice she'd saved them. Once she hadn't. The attending resident, Dr. Martinez, was charting at the bedside station. 28 years old, competent during stable cases, but something about emergencies made his hands shake. Sarah moved toward the crash cart without running, without alarm. She'd learned that panic travels faster than any disease. Controlled urgency. That was the language of people who'd worked in situations where screaming meant death. Martinez. Her voice stayed level. Tension pneumo. Left side. He looked up from his screen, then at the monitor. The oxygen sat was 76 now. Dropping. His face went pale in the way young doctors' faces do when they understand they're holding someone's life in their hands and their hands are full of static. "We need to. I should call Hargrove," he said. Not a question. A life raft he was reaching for. Hargrove's in surgery. 30 minutes minimum. Sarah was already pulling the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, her movements precise as a Swiss watch. Her hands had done this 32 times. Not in sterile oars under fluorescent lights. In sandstorm-blinded tents in the Jolan district of Fallujah, with mortar rounds walking across the compound and blood pooling on canvas stretchers. 32 times. 32 lives. This would be 33. "I can't." Martinez's voice cracked. His fingers trembled as he reached for the equipment and then withdrew them. "I don't have the. I've only done this in simulation. I can't." She didn't waste time on reassurance. Webb's oxygen was 72 now. The window between a save and a body was measured in seconds. Sarah found the second intercostal space, the anatomical landmark hardwired into her nervous system. Just above the third rib. Midclavicular line. She'd located this spot 1,000 times in her mind over the last 72 hours while she'd watched Hargrove's conservative treatment slowly suffocate a Navy SEAL. The skin was cool beneath her fingertips. She prepped with chlorhexidine in a single efficient motion, the smell of antiseptic sharp as ozone, and her hands moved without the consultation of her conscious mind. Muscle memory was just stored experience refusing to let you think. The needle went in at a perfect angle. 1 thrust. Clean. Through the skin, through the fascia, past the intercostal muscles, through the pleural membrane and into the pressurized space that had been crushing Webb's left lung. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a pressure valve opening on a submarine. Like release. Like physics correcting itself. The monitor responded first. 76% oxygen saturation. 82. 88. 92. The numbers climbed as the pressure inside his chest normalized, as his heart regained the space to beat. His heart rate dropped from 141 to 128 to 98 over the next 90 seconds. His blood pressure crawled back into normal range, 112/70, then 118/74. The vital signs of a man no longer in the active process of dying. Sarah secured the catheter with tape, documented the time with the precision of someone who'd written medical reports under IED fire, and called for the chest tube setup. Her voice carried the absolute authority of someone who'd made life-or-death decisions at the age of 24 while sergeants died beside her, and she knew exactly how a system needed to respond. "Get me a 36 French thoracostomy kit," she said to Martinez, who was staring at her with an expression somewhere between religious awe and profound fear. "Now." He moved. People always moved when you gave them an order with that particular inflection, the one that came from having already survived the worst. 23 minutes later, Dr. Hargrove walked through the ICU doors. His surgery was finished. His hands were still warm from the operating room. His sterile field was intact and his dominance was absolute, except it wasn't, because his patient was sitting in a bed with stable vital signs and a chest tube that was draining clear fluid and air, and a nurse had just performed an emergency needle decompression that was completely, unequivocally outside her scope of practice. His face didn't show relief. Relief would have been the human response. Relief would have meant celebrating a life saved. Hargrove's face went white. Then red. Then a color that looked like arterial blood backing up behind his eyes. His jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscles working beneath the skin. "My office," he said. His voice sounded like a knife being drawn from a sheath. "Now." Sarah looked at the monitor one more time. Web sinus rhythm stable. Oxygen 95%. Vital signs all present and accounted for. She excused herself from the ICU with the same composure she'd maintained during 3 tours in Baghdad, during 47 combat operations, during the moment her best friend's femoral artery severed and there was nothing to do but hold his hand while he died. Composure was what you did when the alternative was falling apart, and falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford. The next words out of Hargrove's mouth changed everything. He didn't fire her immediately. He didn't rage at her in the privacy of his office. What he did was activate his network, the intricate web of power that had taken him 20 years to construct. By 6 in the morning, he'd called the hospital board president at home, framing the incident as a rogue nurse endangering a patient by practicing medicine without a license. By 8, he'd contacted Oak Creek Memorial's Credentials Committee and pulled her references from her previous hospital in Atlanta, where her carefully scrubbed resume showed no military service, just a gap in employment she'd explained away as family caregiving. By 10, he'd brought in the state nursing board to investigate whether she'd falsified credentials or maintained false documentation. The weapon wasn't immediate. The weapon was institutional. The weapon was the system itself turning against her, one phone call at a time, one file at a time, one carefully worded allegation at a time. The suspension letter arrived by noon in a manila envelope, hand-delivered by an HR representative with a security escort who wouldn't meet her eyes. Sarah read it in the break room where someone had left a half-empty coffee mug and the fluorescent lights hummed their endless fluorescent hum. The letter was very polite. Very professional. Immediately effective. She drove home in the middle of the day for the first time in months, her hand steady on the steering wheel of her 7-year-old Honda, her chest hollow as a church at midnight. The afternoon traffic moved around her like water around a stone. Savannah looked like every other city in America, ordinary, indifferent, continuing its rotation. She'd saved a life. She'd demonstrated competence that no longer made sense within the institutional hierarchy that had trained her, licensed her, and was now systematically dismantling her. That was the thing they never told you about breaking protocol to save a life. Sometimes the life you saved was the least important consequence. Within hours of saving Marcus Webb's life, Dr. Hargrove was on the phone. The hospital board president's home line rang at 2:51 a.m., and Hargrove didn't apologize for the hour. "We have a situation," he said, his voice carrying the practiced calm of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "One of my staff violated every protocol we have. Performed a procedure she has no authorization to perform. On a Navy patient. There are liability implications you need to understand." The board president, pulled from sleep, listened as Hargrove laid out his version, a rogue nurse overstepping her scope, a dangerous breach of medical hierarchy, a threat to the hospital's credibility that needed immediate containment. By 6 a.m., Hargrove had made his second call. Sarah's references at her previous hospital in Charleston took his inquiry seriously. When a chief of emergency medicine from a larger facility asks about a former employee's credentials, you answer. Hargrove's questions were surgical. How long did Sarah Chen work there? Any concerns about unauthorized procedures? Any issues with scope creep? Any falsification of credentials we should know about? The references were carefully vague. She was a competent nurse, they said, but they offered nothing that would protect her. They offered nothing at all. What Hargrove needed was absence, and absence is easy to weaponize. By 8 a.m., the State Nursing Board had received a formal complaint. Hargrove had connections there too. A former colleague on the licensing committee took his call before breakfast, listened to his concerns about credential fraud and unauthorized medical practice, and agreed that an investigation was warranted. These things need to be taken seriously, the voice on the phone said, and Hargrove smiled because he understood how power actually worked. It wasn't about being right. It was about having the right people on speed dial. Sarah sat in the break room at 11:44 a.m., still wearing yesterday's scrubs because she'd worked through the night, and the hospital administrator appeared with security and a suspension letter in a manila folder. The letter was official, bureaucratic, thorough. Pending investigation of credential fraud, unauthorized medical practice, and violation of hospital protocols. You are suspended with pay pending the outcome of the State Nursing Board investigation. You will surrender your badge immediately. You are not to return to the facility without express authorization. The words were arranged in careful legal language, but what they meant was simple: they were taking everything. She drove home through bright afternoon sunlight, her hand steady on the wheel, her breathing controlled, her face a mask. She'd driven through sandstorms. She'd driven through streets where snipers had fired from rooftops. She could drive through Savannah at noon. She could make it home. She could hold it together for another 15 minutes. 12 minutes. 8. The car climbed the driveway of the small house she'd rented, and she sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, watching the kitchen window where nothing moved. Sarah Chen, Senior Chief Petty Officer, had performed emergency procedures under direct fire. She had triaged casualties in chaos. She had held dying men's hands while calling in air support. She could absolutely handle losing her job. She could absolutely. She couldn't. The kitchen table was where she fell apart. Not loudly. Sarah had learned in Iraq that sound gave away position, and some habits survive 18 years of trying to forget. Her shoulders shook silently, her breath came in gasps she controlled through her nose, and the tears came without the dignity of sound, just wet streaks down her face that she didn't bother to wipe because there was no one here to see. The suspension letter sat on the table where she dropped it, the official letterhead catching the afternoon light. Credential fraud. As if saving a man's life was fraud. As if the hands that had worked in forward surgical teams were somehow unqualified to perform the most basic emergency procedure in trauma medicine. As if she was anyone but exactly who she was. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the breaking point of 18 years of restraint. Of hiding. Of being invisible in rooms full of people she could have taught anything to. Of watching younger doctors make decisions she knew were wrong and keeping her mouth shut. Of smiling and saying, "Of course, doctor, and whatever you think is best," while watching good people suffer under incompetence. She had lost everything to save one man's life. She had traded her invisibility for her career. When the front door opened, Sarah didn't lift her head. She heard her son's boots on the tile, military cadence, even in a civilian house, and she heard his breath catch as he saw her at the table, and she heard him cross the kitchen in 3 long strides. David Chen was 24 years old and wore the trident of a Navy SEAL, and he was built like what happened when aggression was given a uniform and sent to kill in foreign countries. He looked at his mother, and something in his face shifted from confusion to understanding to a cold fury that was terrifying. "Mom? Why are you home?" Sarah couldn't answer. She couldn't explain without saying everything, the things she'd never told him because she was trying to protect him from the kind of person she was. A person who could cut a man's chest open with field shears. A person who had decided which wounded sailors got help and which ones wouldn't make it and lived with those decisions. A person who broke protocols because protocols were written by people who'd never been under fire. What happened? David's voice was sharp, military precision in a kitchen that smelled like the coffee she'd abandoned an hour ago. I saved someone's life, Sarah said, and her voice didn't sound like hers. It sounded broken. And they're taking everything. David's eyes narrowed. He kneeled beside her chair, something a SEAL officer didn't do lightly, kneeling, and his voice dropped. The training accident. The Navy SEAL. That was your case. Sarah nodded. And they fired you for saving him. Suspended. Pending investigation. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then David stood up, and Sarah heard the distinctive sound of a military phone being pulled from a pocket, the screen unlocking with a biometric scan, a number dialed with the speed of muscle memory. "Sir, it's Chen," he said, and his voice was the voice of a subordinate addressing a superior. "My mother just got suspended. For saving Commander Webb's life. The hospital is investigating her credentials. I need you to know who she really is." Sarah tried to speak. The words wouldn't come. She watched her son's face as he listened, watched him nod at something said on the other end of the line, watched him close his eyes briefly like he was receiving orders that changed the trajectory of the next 6 hours. "Understood, sir." "Thank you, sir." He hung up. "What did you do?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "What you couldn't do," David said, and he sat down across from his mother at the kitchen table. "I told them the truth. I told them what you did. And I told them you saved a Navy SEAL with your hands because you knew how, because you've spent your whole life knowing things like that. David, you don't understand. If they find out about my service, if the hospital learns." "Then they learn," he said simply. "Mom, you're a hero. You've been a hero this whole time. You've just been quiet about it." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to protect her son from the fallout that was about to rain down, wanted to keep the secrets that had kept him safe. But something in his face stopped her. Something that looked like pride. She had spent 18 years being invisible, and her son had seen her immediately. 18 hours, David said. They're sending a team. 18 hours, and then the truth walks through that hospital door. Sarah sat in the kitchen of the small house she'd rented to be unremarkable, and for the first time in months, she didn't fight her tears. She let her son see her break. And in the breaking, something shifted. The weight of invisibility was about to end. The cost of that would be high, she could already see it, the career she'd built dissolving, the questions that would come, the paperwork and investigations and depositions. But the alternative was to stay broken at a kitchen table while a man she'd trained, a man she'd brought back from the edge of death, took the blame for a protocol that existed for people who'd never been in a forward operating base. The suspension letter sat on the table, official and final. But nothing was final until 18 hours had passed and the night turned into morning and the world learned that the invisible nurse had been visible all along. David's hands trembled as he dialed. Not from fear, from the kind of controlled anger that comes from watching your mother break at a kitchen table because the world didn't know who she was. One phone call. That's all it took. He reached the executive officer of Naval Special Warfare Group 2 and said 6 words, "My mother saved a SEAL's life." 18 hours later, the sky split open. The UH-60M Black Hawk descended through the Savannah morning like judgment itself, rotors churning the air into submission, kicking up gravel across the Oak Creek Memorial parking lot hard enough to crack windshields. News vans scattered. A woman dropped her coffee cup. The helicopter touched down at 08 for 7 hours, and before the rotors had even slowed, the side doors opened and boots hit the concrete, not running, never running, just moving with the terrifying fluid precision of men who'd trained to move through hell itself. Commander James Breaker Holloway walked through the emergency entrance like he owned it, dress uniform immaculate, medals arrayed across his chest like a battlefield map. Behind him came 3 more SEAL team operators and a Navy JG officer in a service-dress blue uniform so pressed it could cut glass. The ER staff froze. A nurse dropped a medication tray. The sound of pills scattering across tile echoed through the silence like gunshots. "I need Senior Chief Chen." Not a request. A command. His voice moved through the hospital like a tank idling in a garage, low, powerful, impossible to ignore. Now. Sarah wasn't in the building. She was home, sitting in her truck in the hospital parking lot, watching the morning light hit the windshield, unable to convince her hands to turn the key. The suspension letter was still in her scrub pocket. The state board investigation was still pending. Everything she'd built in 18 years of invisibility had collapsed in a single night because she'd chosen to save a life instead of obey protocol. She didn't hear the helicopter at first. It wasn't until the parking lot erupted in chaos, news cameras swinging toward the sky, hospital security radioing frantically, that she looked up and saw it. A military transport helicopter. In her hospital parking lot. Her stomach dropped. Something was wrong with Webb. Something had gone critical. She was moving before conscious thought caught up, muscle memory overriding logic, her body already in motion as she crossed the parking lot toward the emergency entrance. The rotor wash slammed into her like a physical force. She shielded her face and kept moving, and that's when she saw them, boots on tile, a column of uniformed Navy personnel moving through the automatic doors with the kind of purpose that made people get out of the way without being told. The lobby of Oak Creek Memorial went dead silent. Not the quiet of a hospital at rest. The silence of a room recognizing that something fundamental had shifted. David stood in the center of the lobby, and his voice cut through the fluorescent hum like a blade. "My mother." Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. Sarah froze in the doorway, the morning light catching her face. For a moment, just one moment, the composed mask slipped. Her eyes widened. Her hand moved to her chest as if checking that her heartbeat still existed. Then the composure returned. Jaw tight. Shoulders back. The night shift nurse vanished, and something else took her place. Commander Holloway's eyes found her across the crowded lobby, and for a moment the two of them locked in the kind of recognition that only happens between people who've carried the same weight. Then he moved toward her with the rest of his team in formation, and the hospital staff pressed themselves against walls to let them pass. Senior Chief Chen. His voice was respect incarnate. "Good to finally meet you." A Navy nurse captain in dress blue stepped forward, and in her hands was a file, thick, official, marked with security classifications that made the hospital's medical records look like sticky notes. She opened it and began to read, her voice steady and clear. 3 tours in Baghdad. Fallujah, Sanjan Valley, Bagram Airfield. She turned the page. 2 Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medals. Another page. Trained over 200 combat medics in forward surgical teams. She looked up from the file, and her eyes found Sarah's. "The Army wanted to keep you. So did the Air Force. But you chose Navy." The gathered staff, nurses, residents, orderlies, administrators who'd watched Sarah Chen push meds and take orders for 18 months, stared like they were watching a stranger materialize before their eyes. Which, in a way, they were. Commander Holloway stepped closer, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every mission, every life saved, every loss carried. Senior Chief holds the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Valor. Awarded for performing emergency field amputations under direct fire while dragging wounded sailors to cover during the Battle of Baghdad, March 2004. He paused, letting that sink in. She saved more lives in combat than most of you will see in your entire careers. Sarah's hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. But something had broken open in her chest, not weakness, but the final shattering of the wall she'd built between who she was and who the world had allowed her to be. She wasn't crying. Senior Chief Petty Officers don't cry in front of witnesses. But her eyes glistened, and she didn't blink to clear them. That's when Dr. Richard Hargrove emerged from the back corridor, still wearing his white coat like armor, still believing his authority was fireproof. He'd heard the commotion. He'd heard the words Navy and military and assumed he understood the situation. He assumed he was still in control. "I don't know what this is about," he said, his voice carrying that condescending tone that had worked so well for 20 years, "but hospital protocol requires." A Navy JAG officer stepped forward, Captain Morrison, whose uniform suggested she'd seen more combat zones than Hargrove had seen surgical suites. "Dr. Hargrove, I'm Captain Morrison, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. You're under investigation for obstructing medical treatment of an active duty service member, specifically Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, whose training accident is now part of a federal military investigation." The color drained from Hargrove's face like someone had pulled a plug. "You delayed appropriate care. You made treatment decisions that endangered a SEAL team operator's life. You actively prevented a qualified medical professional from providing critical intervention." Captain Morrison's voice was ice water. Senior Chief Chen performed an emergency needle decompression that saved his life. "Your interference nearly killed him." Hargrove's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Behind him, nurses who'd once feared him were now watching him shrink. The mythology of his authority, built on 20 years of dominance, on-board connections and institutional loyalty, was evaporating in real time. The hospital board president, James Sterling, emerged from his office looking pale. He'd already received 3 calls this morning from federal investigators. He'd already understood that his hospital was now part of a national security investigation because one of his physicians had tormented a decorated Navy veteran into hiding. "Dr. Hargrove," Sterling said, and his voice carried the professional courtesy of a man delivering a death sentence, "your employment at Oak Creek Memorial is terminated, effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks severance and COBRA coverage. Security will escort you to retrieve your personal belongings." He paused, and his next words were designed for the 3 local news cameras now filming through the lobby windows. "This hospital does not tolerate retaliation against any staff member, particularly those who demonstrate exceptional clinical judgment." Senior Chief Chen's decision to intervene saved a life. Dr. Hargrove's interference nearly cost that life. That ends today. Hargrove stood in the center of the lobby, surrounded by Navy personnel in dress blues, flanked by federal investigators, and watched his entire career collapse in front of approximately 47 witnesses and 3 camera crews. His hands trembled. His voice cracked when he tried to speak. The professional invulnerability he'd cultivated for 2 decades evaporated like morning fog. Security escorted him to collect his personal items. Within the hour, a campus security officer was walking him to his car. By noon, the hospital's legal team had issued a statement. By 3 o'clock, the board president had made calls to every hospital administrator in Georgia, explaining that Richard Hargrove's employment had been terminated due to interference with treatment and retaliation against medical staff. The damage spiraled. A hospital in Atlanta that had been considering hiring him for a promotion suddenly rescinded the offer. The medical board began their own investigation into his practice patterns. His wife, Dr. Catherine Hargrove, a respected cardiologist, began receiving calls from colleagues asking carefully phrased questions about her husband's behavior. Within a week, she filed for separation. 6 months later, Richard Hargrove stood in a fluorescent-lit classroom at Savannah Community College, teaching CPR certification to board pharmacy technicians and dental assistants for $18 an hour. The classroom smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams. He demonstrated chest compressions on plastic mannequins named and lifeless, unblinking, the perfect audience for a man nobody looked at anymore. When former colleagues saw him in the hospital or at conferences, they developed sudden urgent appointments. The invisibility he'd weaponized against Sarah Chen had become his own permanent condition. He'd finally become what she'd been pretending to be. But Sarah Chen wasn't invisible anymore. 6 months after the helicopter landed, Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen stood in the auditorium at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth in uniform. Not scrubs. Uniform. Dress blues with ribbons arranged like a map of survival, Bronze Star, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Valor positioned exactly where it belonged. 60 Navy corpsmen sat in the seats before her, taking notes, watching the woman who'd just been announced as the new Director of Combat Medical Training Innovation for the entire Naval Medical Center. "Tension pneumothorax presents subtly," she told them, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd performed the procedure under fire, in sandstorms, with nothing but muscle memory and the will to keep people alive. Distended neck veins. Absent breath sounds. Falling oxygen saturation. You have maybe 4 minutes before cardiac arrest. You don't wait for a doctor. You don't ask permission. You move. The students hung on every word. In the back row, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb sat with his wife, both of them watching Sarah teach. Webb was fully recovered, returned to duty, and wearing the same insignia as the woman who'd saved his life. His daughter, 8 years old, sat between them, watching her mother's savior with the kind of wonder that made sense. Sarah Chen was the reason her father had come home. David Chen sat with his commanding officer. His mother's son. The man who'd made one phone call that changed everything. After class, an older Navy captain approached Sarah, someone she'd trained 20 years ago, before Baghdad, before the hiding, before everything. "Senior Chief, the Navy wants you to know we're proud to have you back. We never should have let you go." Sarah nodded, the kind of small acknowledgement that carried weight. "The Navy didn't let me go, sir. I chose to leave. Now I'm choosing to return." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady as surgical steel, "and I'm never hiding again." At Oak Creek Memorial in Savannah, a new award was being prepared for its first presentation, the Sarah Chen Award for Clinical Courage, given annually to the nurse or physician who demonstrated exceptional clinical judgment in the face of institutional pressure. The first nominee was already submitted, Dr. Martinez, the resident who'd frozen during the emergency, but who'd spent the past 6 months studying everything Sarah Chen had published about combat trauma care, teaching his students to respect experience over hierarchy, and learning that the strongest leaders are the ones humble enough to listen. The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial still existed. The break room still had tired nurses checking their phones. The fluorescent lights still hummed their endless electronic prayer. But something had changed. A story had taken root. Not a legend, something better. The truth. That the strongest person in the room is often the quietest one. That true authority comes from what you can do, not what you claim. That when you stand in front of someone trying to silence you, the only thing that matters is whether you choose silence back. Sarah Chen had chosen differently. And in choosing to act, she'd reminded everyone watching that heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet night shift nurse who knows exactly what to do when the person next to her freezes. Sometimes it's the person nobody's looking at until suddenly, everything changes. The story of what happened at Oak Creek Memorial spread through medical schools, through nursing programs, through military hospitals. Medical educators used it as a case study in institutional power and clinical competence. Ethics boards cited it as an example of when protocol must yield to expertise. And in every hospital emergency room in America, there were nurses, quiet, competent, carrying secrets, who recognized themselves in Sarah Chen's story and understood that their value didn't depend on the world seeing them. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If this story resonates with you, please subscribe for more narratives about the quiet strength we carry. Like this video, comment below about a time you stood up for what was right despite the cost, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that true power comes from competence, not titles. You're watching Code Whisperers, where the strongest warriors are the ones who've learned to fight for others. Thank you for being here.